Welcome to The Explainer. So let's talk about a president whose story you might think you know. But here's the thing. His greatest chapter, the one that really defined him, actually started after he left the White House.
Just one. Think about that for a second. That's the number of former U.S. presidents who, after leaving the highest office in the land, went on to serve in Congress. Only one has ever done it.
His life was kind of like a dramatic two-act play. You've got Act 1, his presidency, which you've probably heard a little about, but it's Act 2, what happened after he left office, that truly cemented his place in history.
To really get who this guy was, you have to go all the way back to the beginning. John Quincy Adams, or JQA, wasn't just born into politics. He was basically born into the idea of America itself. His dad was John Adams, the second president, and his mom was the brilliant and formidable Abigail Adams. This was America's very first political dynasty. I mean, from the very beginning, his life was just a masterclass in how to run a country. While other kids were, just being kids, he was off in Europe learning diplomacy. By the time he was just 14, he'd already served as a secretary on a diplomatic mission to Russia. This wasn't just school, this was an apprenticeship for greatness.
And all that training? Well, it paid off. Big time. Before he was ever president, Adams was the Secretary of State under James Monroe. And to put it simply, he was a giant. He is still considered one of the absolute greatest secretaries of state in all of American history.
His track record was just staggering. He's the guy who negotiated the northern border with Canada, he got Florida from Spain, and he pushed America's claim out to the Pacific Northwest, already thinking about trade with Asia. He was literally drawing the map of the country we know today. His strategic vision was just incredible.
And then you have his masterpiece, the Monroe Doctrine. As the main architect behind this, he pretty much put the world on notice and told the empires of Europe that the Americas were no longer their playground for colonization. So the crucial point here is this. By the time he ran for president, you could argue he was the most qualified candidate the country had ever seen.
But here's the twist. When he finally got to the very top, the peak of American power in 1824, his presidency started not with a bang, but with a crisis. A huge controversy that would cast a shadow over his entire time in office.
So the election of 1824 was a complete mess. You had four major candidates, all from the same party, and they all split the vote. Andrew Jackson, the famous war hero, won the most votes, but, and this is a big but, nobody got an actual majority. And that meant the decision got thrown to the House of Representatives.
Now, Henry Clay, who came in fourth, was out of the running, but he just so happened to be the Speaker of the House. He convinced his supporters to back Adams, who then won the presidency, and what was Adams' first big move as president? He turned around and named Henry Clay as his Secretary of State. Jackson's camp just exploded. They screamed corrupt bargain, and that accusation haunted Adams for the next 4 years. So he comes into office with this incredibly ambitious, forward-thinking vision, a whole network of roads and canals, a national university, things like that. But a hostile Congress, totally fired up by that corrupt bargain story, blocked him at every single turn. So in 1828, Jackson comes back and just trounces him. For any other politician, this would have been the bitter end of the story.
So what do you do? I mean, really, what do you do when you've hit the absolute top and then come crashing down in a humiliating defeat? Well, for Adams, the answer was something nobody saw coming.
Most ex-presidents would just retire, maybe write their memoirs, and kind of fade away as elder statesmen. But John Quincy Adams was not most presidents. In 1830, just 2 years after that crushing loss, he did the unthinkable. He ran for a seat in Congress from his home district in Massachusetts, and he won. This was the start of the most incredible second act in all of American political history.
And it was here, in the House of Representatives, that Adams, now known as Old Man Eloquent, finally found his true, uncompromising voice. He found the cause that would define his real legacy, the fight against slavery.
His main target became something called the gag rule. Basically, pro-slavery congressmen passed a rule that automatically silenced any and all citizen petitions about slavery. Think about what that means. It was a direct attack on free speech, an attempt to make it impossible to even talk about the biggest moral issue facing the country.
Adams waged this brilliant, stubborn, and often very lonely war against the rule. For years, he would stand up on the House floor and try to read petitions from abolitionists, forcing his opponents to literally silence him and showing everyone just how tyrannical the rule was.
This fight transformed him from a frustrated ex-president into a fearless moral warrior, and after nearly a decade, he won. The gag rule was repealed.
And this wasn't just some political game for him. You can look at his private journals from years earlier, and you see a man who was deeply, personally tormented by slavery. He called it a stain on the nation's character. So his public fight was fueled by a really profound private conviction.
This whole crusade reached its climax in 1841. At 73 years old, the former President of the United States stood before the Supreme Court to argue the famous Amistad case. He defended a group of Africans who had mutinied on a slave ship, and he won them their freedom. It was just a stunning victory for human rights.
Adams kept serving in Congress right up until the very end. He actually collapsed from a stroke right there on the floor of the House of Representatives in 1848. His incredible second act really forces us to completely rethink his entire career and what it even means to be successful in public life.
So when you look at his life, you see these two totally different chapters. Act 1, a frustrating, one-term presidency defined by political gridlock, and then Act 2, 17 heroic years in Congress as the nation's leading champion of free speech and a fierce opponent of slavery.
Which really leaves us with a question to think about. What's the true measure of a legacy? Is it reaching the highest office you possibly can, or is it about the fight you wage for the things you truly believe in? John Quincy Adams' story seems to suggest that sometimes your greatest victory can come long after your biggest defeat.